I also want to begin by acknowledging the First Nations people of this community, the community that I live in, which is on Dja Dja Wurrung country, but also the communities across Australia. And particularly to acknowledge the wisdom, the knowledge from thousands and thousands of years that First Nations people have to offer us. And you'll find that influence is very much present in this lecture. I also want to, just before I really start, thank the Backhouse Lecture Committee, partly for asking me to do this. And I think while it's a daunting thing always to be asked to do something like this, it's also a chance to spend time with contemplating, reflecting on your own experience. And that's been a very useful thing to do. And I felt very upheld by that, with many people's prayers, thoughts holding in the light. So to the Backhouse Lecture Committee for that, and for many other people who are doing that. Thank you very much. So why seek to live life in union with spirit? I think such a life, in my experience, and that of many other people, is one that is a fuller, richer, more meaning-filled and deeper life. And it means moving beyond many of the opposites that we experience in our life, what's often called a divided life, to a place of wholeness and integrating all of who we are in all that we do. And really, I think one of the main aspects of this is coming to know all of yourself and to accept and love all of yourself, the shadow and the treasure, the egoistic and the altruistic, the strong and the vulnerable, the one who's able to be and the one who's able to do. And moving beyond these opposites helps us to come to a place of greater transcendence and integration. And ideally, and of course this is the ideal, we move to a place where all that we do is underpinned by all that we are, our being self, our best being self. And living from that place, I think, can enhance all of your life. It doesn't necessarily mean that your life is easier or that this is an easy thing to do. But I think living from this place means that you often experience those struggles as having potential for being life enhancing rather than life denying. And I think it helps you get to a place where the fundamental essence of who you are is about able to help you make active decisions and choices from that place. And I've chosen this particular image, which you can see behind me, as embodying that for me. And I think about this as the image of the dancing trees. It's an image that Drew Lawson took while we were on holidays in Scotland. And I think it's partly about the strength and solidity of the tree, which is obviously very grounded in the earth, but that sense of transcendence in the light, in the leaves, there's such a sense of movement about it as well. So I think this is the life we're called to as Quakers. That's that the spirit gives us life, and what we need to do is to seek being in union with it. Now, I'm going to try and make connections in this lecture between my own experience of this and that of other people, those that I have journeyed with. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But just a brief comment about language. I know for many people embracing the spiritual journey, language is a difficult issue. Often because of past involvement with perhaps a religious tradition that wasn't life enhancing. So I use the word spirit in the sense of what is meaningful, what is both greater than the self and within the self. Some people might talk about that as God or light within. So please choose the language that feels right for you. I have used the language, obviously, that the people who've also written bits that I'm going to read, I've used their language, of course. And I also talk a bit about the image of a journey, and I think it's helpful to talk about this spiritual journey. partly because journeys are so different and diverse. So we often think about a journey as being neat and linear. We start, we get to the destination. But of course, many journeys are not like that. Sometimes things happen along the way that are unexpected. Some of them are very frustrating times. Some of them are very joyful times. Sometimes we end up in a circuitous route to get to where we want to go. Sometimes we have to turn back and start at the beginning all over again. No one right way. So the way the lecture will work is it divides into two parts. And the first part, I'll just show you on here. The left-hand side is really what I think about as the pillars, or sometimes the tensions, the paradoxes of the spiritual journey. And the right-hand side is ways that we can nurture ourselves in the spiritual journey. And this, the image in the middle is of a Quaker tapestry. And I've chosen that image because while we like to talk about things as if they're in nice, neat categories, of course they're not. They blend together, and it's often the fusion of colors that makes the image particularly rich. Now, First Nations people, when they are doing something like a lecture or presentation, or when they're just meeting each other, will locate themselves in terms of their family and community, so that they understand where each other is coming from more fully. And I think that's a really useful thing to do. And so I want to begin by giving a little bit of background about myself. So I was born in Scotland. My family were Presbyterians, and we went to church every Sunday. There were church ministers in my mother's background. We emigrated to Australia when I was 9 and continued to be part of the Presbyterian Church. This is before the days of the Uniting Church. I've lived with Drew Lawson, who many of you will know, a constant source of spiritual inspiration. And we live in a small intentional community and have for over 30 years. That's also been a place of spiritual nurture and learning for me. I've been very fortunate to facilitate the Meeting for Learning for over 20 years with other facilitators. And that's also been an incredibly deep sense of learning in all sorts of ways. And I'm particularly grateful to the people from Meeting for Learning, as well as others who've contributed to my own learning and also contributed their writing to this lecture. I've worked as a social worker for many years, and in the last 20 years have been working as a university teacher. And one of the great challenges for me, I think, about my work life is how to integrate this spiritual into it. And that's been something that I've often talked about at Meeting for Learning. Okay, so what I want to do now then is to go on to the first aspect of seeking union with spirit. And you can see here, it's about reflecting on our spiritual experience. And I'm going to talk about an experience of mine. I always find it interesting when I'm doing something like this, just to see what emerges really, what example comes up that seems to be from spirit for me to talk about. And so this is the experience that came. So when we immigrated to Australia, my parents fulfilled the Great Australian Dream by building a house. So we moved after a year to Frankston, and in the Presbyterian Church in Frankston, children who were in the 6th year, the final year of primary school, were encouraged to sit for a scholarship that would help fund their transition to secondary school. So my parents were very keen for me to do this. You know, building a house is not a cheap thing to do. And so I agreed. But when I started the classes that were part of this process, the classes were essentially a form of Bible study. and I became increasingly uncomfortable with the classes. Now, I couldn't put it into words in any way that would have seemed reasonable to anybody else at that time, but I just had a deep sense of unease. And I think with my adult self, I can say that what I feared was that my sense, my quite strong experience of God or a spirit, I feared was going to be put into some kind of box and tidied away, and that it wouldn't be the same kind of powerful experience to me anymore. So one day I was walking to see a friend through a local park, and this slide represents that park. And I had a very strong sense of being connected to the park, to the trees, the grass, the sky, and to God. And God saying to me, "Don't worry, it will be all right. You will never lose me." So that was a very powerful experience, I think, for a 10-year-old by then. And one that I didn't talk about for many years. It felt too vulnerable, I think, or I felt too vulnerable to it being somehow rationalized or explained away, or I guess people thinking I was really very strange. But it was a very reassuring experience. And I think it left me with a very deep assumption that God always would be present in my life. And that certainty, that sense of clarity about that stayed with me for a very long time. So I think for me, and I know that for some people this will seem like a relatively dramatic experience, this is a symbol of the kinds of experiences that we can have, that it's important to notice and pay attention to reflect on them, to sit with them, to understand what they have meant for us and how they've influenced our lives. Now, there is no one way, there's no one right spiritual experience, and how these are expressed will vary hugely from person to person. And it might be that for some people, that sense of transcendence or connection to spirit comes from, it might be from nature, but might equally be from connecting to other people. It might be in doing some everyday task. It might be sitting and meeting for worship. It might be having a prayerful time of retreat. There really is no one right way. And what's important is that we affirm them when they happen. Now, I think what also influences our spiritual experience that it's important to pay attention to is the context, our other experiences, our own history, and the influence this has on us. And so I'm going on to this slide, which is of part of the island of Iona, a place that I particularly love and that has very strong spiritual significance for me. But what I probably most want to talk about here is paying attention to both your own family history and how that's influenced you, but also the broader social context and what's going on around you. I mean, this time that we're living in, I think, is a very powerful time for noticing what's happening for a range of people. And I've been pleasantly surprised by the number of people who have said to me, this experience of COVID has made me stop and think, what am I doing with my life? Do I want to continue to rush around in the busy kind of way that I tend to do, or do I want really to move to a different kind of life? So I'm back to the same experience and what my life was like at that time. So my family experience of religion was in the Presbyterian Church, but very different attitudes to it from my parents. So my mother's father had been a Presbyterian minister and was quite an emotionally abusive man. So she felt very skeptical. She had a very healthy, perhaps not cynicism, but she certainly looked at the church with rigorous eyes to see what they were doing. So the institutional church was not something that she was especially positive about. But her mother was a very, she would have talked about her as a very spiritual woman and believed very much in the power of prayer. And so she had influenced my mother strongly from that point of view. So my mother's sense of the spirit was about the essence, if you like. My father's experience of the church was quite the opposite, was very positive. And he really valued the church as community. He loved to sing, so he loved singing in the church. And he also really liked the democratic nature of the Presbyterian church. And I won't go into detail about that, but you know, compared to some other churches, it's much less hierarchical. So I had these two quite different influences. One part of my family saying, church is great, really important community, have a good time there. And the other side saying, church is not so great, but the essence of what the church is teaching is really important. So I think those two very different ways of looking at this was also a really influential part of my life. And I think I was very fortunate to have that because the assumption it left me with was something like, there are many ways to embrace the spiritual and religious life. There isn't just one, and there are many angles to people's experience of this. Now, I know that some of you will have had very different experiences about this. So it's important to look back to what was your experience and how was that influenced by the broader context. So my parents would talk about the conflict between Protestants and Catholics, for example. That was very powerful for my mother. Her family had originally come from Ireland. And so she would talk very powerfully, really, about the painful interaction between religion and politics and economics. One of the things that's hard about this is that in our Western culture, we have such a strong view that there is one right way to do things. And it's hard to shift that to an assumption that there are many ways. Drew and I, quite early in our time of Quakers, were involved in a small worshipping group in Castlemaine. And our small group thought it would be a good thing to have a gathering at a weekend. We only met monthly, so it wasn't a lot of time to really connect with each other. So we organized a weekend gathering, and on the first session on the Saturday morning, we asked people to just say a little bit about their spiritual journey and what was important in their spiritual experience in small groups. And people talked about the very diverse experiences in a very deep and powerful way. But one of the things that emerged from that was that some people had felt more accepted than others within Friends. And no doubt people were reacting from their own positive and negative experiences, but particularly those who were Christian felt quite challenged often by other people about talking about their relationship with Christ. There was also a woman who talked about having very powerful, I suppose you'd say, visions, sometimes in dreams, and having been labeled as being mentally ill. So I think there is something that's hard for us to accept about the great diversity there is of religious and spiritual experience. And it's very important to do that. And I want to just read a poem by Sue Wilson, who was a Queensland friend and also a Meeting for Learning facilitator, that I think really sums this up for me. So the poem is called Spirit as Bird. The red flashing wren dances before me a few marvelous minutes. Experts interrogate me. Was it black with scarlet back or the crimson variety? Do you know the wren responds to certain calls that we could teach you? What I know is this. My bird lives among the rocks, roots, and growth at my ground of being, following its own rhythm. I want to stand with a steady heart when it comes blazing out. So I think that's very powerful for me. So I want to move on now to three dualities, I think, of the spiritual journey. And these are, firstly, darkness and light, then love and truth, and then the inner and outer, and how we combine those. And I've chosen this image because I think it clearly fits with darkness and light, but I think it also can help us think about what are some of the subtleties of all of these, and how can we appreciate and value both the darkness and the light, the love and the truth, and see how they blend together so well. So I think it's important to talk about darkness and light because these are inevitable parts of the spiritual journey. And obviously, of course, we would prefer, most of us, to be in the light. Although sometimes for people, accepting the light in themselves is harder than accepting the dark. So I think for me, this is partly about accepting both within ourselves, what are the parts of me that I more clearly value, I accept, I see them as part of the giftedness of who I am. What are the parts of me that I see as the less acceptable parts, and how can I come to accept those as well? It's also about the times in our spiritual journey, the times in our life that have these times of lightness and darkness. I particularly like Parker Palmer's way of writing about this, and he talks about depression as part of his dark night journey. So he talks about that as a total eclipse of light and hope, which becomes a pilgrimage to find his true self, a person of weakness and strength, liability and giftedness, darkness and life. And he says, I now know that to be whole means to reject none of it, but to embrace all of it. Now, some people, I think, experience darkness and light as very deep mountains and valleys, very difficult times of struggle, and then perhaps times of great joy. And some of us are more likely to be hills and plains people. So some people have the experiences like Parker Palmer of that, the depths and heights. Other people, it might be more like irritability, annoyance, restlessness, but these are equally times of struggle that it's important to recognize as part of the spiritual journey. So rather than feeling frustrated by them or overcome by them, to say, what is this about for me? What's the meaning of it? How can I engage with this more fully? Now, thinking then about these all three, I think, all interconnect. So thinking about love and truth, and of course we have the wonderful advice and query of take heed, dear friends, to the promptings of love and truth in your hearts. Trust them as the leadings of God, whose light shows us our darkness and brings us to new life. So I think early Quakers were much better at this than we tend to be, partly because they lived in communities where they knew each other, everybody was familiar with each other, and in a sense, they gave each other permission to do this as well. And John Woolman epitomizes this for me, a man who was probably difficult to live with, but who had, I think, a gentle ability to say to people, I'm just really not feeling comfortable about this. I'm not feeling comfortable about what you're doing, or this just doesn't feel right to me about what our meeting is doing. But the impetus, we all need this. We need somebody who is able to be lovingly truthful to us, or truthfully loving to us, able to help us see the things that we need in order for us to be able to grow. But it's how this is done that is really significant, I think, and that it's often the greatest challenge. And we probably all know this. If we are able to say from the right place within us, I am feeling unsure, I'm not comfortable, this doesn't feel right, we're much more likely to get a positive response. Drew at one time thought that I was doing too much, and too much from a place of shoulds rather than leadings. You know, Protestant work ethic donated by my family. You should work hard. And I had embraced that. So fortunately, he was able to say to me, you know, I'm just wondering if all of the things that you're doing come from a place of being led, or whether some of them are not so helpful shoulds. Now, if he had said to me, I think you're working too hard, you should do less, I would have been much less responsive. Because he was able to say it in a lovingly truthful way, I was able to hear the message and think, yep, I think I am doing too much. I need to do less. So we need people in our lives. We need to ask for people to do that. And being able to do that for each other, I think, connects in with the next duality, which is about, should we be spending time on the inner life, or should we be more active in the external world? I think if we're able to get right the loving truthfulness, we're often able to be acting better, more helpfully in the external world. Now, Quakers, I think, often experience this duality as a fairly major tension. Is it a selfish thing to be focusing on my inner spiritual growth? Given the nature of the world, should I not be concentrating on being active in it? Can being contemplative really be helpful in the world, or is that just really opting out? But one of the stories I love here is the story of the Rainmaker. And I've taken this from Robert Johnson, but I think there are versions of this. It's really a myth that I think is replicated in lots of ways across the world. So a Chinese village is besieged by drought, and the villagers are really desperate. They've tried everything, and they decide the only thing left to do is to call for the famous Rainmaker. So he arrives and he asks them to build him a hut so that he can go to the hut and get ready for the rainmaking ceremony. So on the fourth day, he's asked for 5 days, but on the fourth day it rains and the village is saved, and the villagers are just incredibly grateful. So they dragged him out of the hut and they say, you know, thank you. And then one of them says, well, how did you do it? How did you make it rain? And the Rainmaker says, oh, you have to understand, when I arrived, I was so out of sorts within myself. I needed to get right within before I could do the ceremony. And actually, I never got to it. Now, I think the thing I love about this story, and I know not everybody sees it with quite such a rosy glow as me, is that it suggests that if we are right within, we are more likely to be able to change the world, to change our environment, because we are coming from a better place. Jenny Spinks, in her Backhouse Lecture, suggested that as being our true selves and listening to the promptings of the spirit, that means that we can make a change in our lives, and then we can bring about wider change. And certainly I know that if I am right within, I am much less likely to project my unhappiness or grumpiness onto the rest of the world. I'm much more likely to be in a space where I can calmly raise a difficult issue in a meeting in a way that is more likely to lead to positive resolution. I'm more likely to be able to come up with an idea that will be helpful, or simply to sit with people who need to explore what's painful for them. I think the other thing I like about the Rainmaker story is that it does suggest the importance of community to me, and the environment. Let's pay attention to who do we make these decisions with, and how do we as community support people to get right within, including ourselves, so that we can do better both within and also in the external world. Now I want to go next. I'm moving now to the right-hand side of this diagram. So I'm moving on to so how do we nurture ourselves? And of course, these reflect my experience and may be different for you. And particular things may be helpful for you at different times. So I'm really just putting these out as possibilities and suggestions. The first one, though, I do think is a really important one. And as Quakers, I think we're all really pretty much on board with this, is the power of silence. And one of the advices in Query says, seek to know an inward stillness, even amid the activities of daily life. So silence, inner stillness, whichever one of those that language that feels better for you. And Drew Lawson writes, silence is not absence, it is deeper connectedness. It is the fullness of God. Silence forms community, brings an awareness of others in difficulty, brings an awareness of our reality of being loved unconditionally. So I think silence and stillness is at the heart of us as Quakers. And for me, I think part of the aim of living in union with spirit is about having that inner stillness being part of all that I do. And I think for me in my life, probably particularly in my working life, but in life generally, that's been the struggle, the aim to become better at operating from that kind of space. And I think I can more often now feel the strength of spirit in my workplace. I'm particularly conscious of it in facilitating classes and workshops with more of a sense of vocation and coming from that place. But I also will say to myself before I go into a difficult meeting or before I go into a tedious meeting, I really need to come from that place so that I'm approaching this from the place of spirit rather than from the place of I just have to do this. So for me, though, in order to be able to do that, to cultivate that sense of coming from a place of stillness, I also need times of utter stillness and silence, and those things that nurture my spirit. And I think for all of us, we need to work out how do we cultivate that? How do we become aware of it? One of my early experiences in Friends was going to a meeting in Bristol at Redland Meeting. And I'd only probably been going to meeting for maybe several months. I was partly attracted to the meeting because they had a very active social action group. But I also loved the silence of meeting for worship. It was something that was very different from the faith tradition that I had come from. And I relished that, but I struggled with it. I found it really difficult. A whole hour, more or less, of silence with, Redland meeting was quite a big meeting. And so, of course, there would be people who spoke, but it was a lot of silence. So on this particular day, I arrived late at meeting, and I hate being late for things, particularly things like meeting. And so I thought I would just wait. I was coming for a social action meeting at lunchtime. But the person on the door said, no, you must go in. There will be other people who will be late. And so we went in together, and I felt absolutely enfolded by the depth of the silence. It was palpable. It was so deep. I felt absolutely moved by it. It was as if being in the meeting as it gradually became more gathered, it had been harder for me somehow to embrace the depth of silence. But coming into it like that was a really powerful experience. Now, I'm not recommending that everybody takes it in turns to come late to meeting to experience this. And I'm sure most of you have experienced that strength of meeting And that again, I think, is part of the strength of community that can help us to reach the depths of silence in that kind of way. So I think it's also important then for us to realize that that is always there if we just remember to notice it. And I just want to read something from Diana Campbell, who's a Meeting for Learning participant, that relates to this. Yesterday was a very busy day, and I thought that when I returned to the labyrinth this morning, that it would take me a good bit of time to center down and get grounded again. To my delight, I immediately felt the profound stillness of the sense that I have identified as resting in spirit. I was not aware of it when involved in the busyness, and yet it was clearly with me anyway. This is something I hope will continue to be and become always so accessible to me when I do focus and become aware, able to hear the nudges, promptings, and leadings of the spirit because I am resting in it, even in my busyness. I think it's important for me to say that while silence can be healing and restorative and deep, it can also be challenging. It can be a place, helpfully, I think, in the end, where anxieties, concerns, and painful memories and griefs can arise more easily. But I think I want to read a poem from David Paris, and his experience shows how the silence of meeting for worship can also be a place to wrestle with what needs to emerge. I enter the silence and wait for the light. There is only darkness. Then slowly, a swirling kaleidoscope of dark sepia shards. I try to bring them together to make sense of them, but fear stops me. I try to force color on them to make them less bleak, less fearsome, but only strong colors appear. Deep blues and purples, crimsons and dark reds. I dare not steady them and make sense of them because I know that if I do, what I see will be too awful to see, too awful to face. Carcasses rotting in the sun, the shame of poverty. But even worse than that, even worse. The spirit speaks to me through another friend. That thing you fear so much, it is not revolting. It is not disgusting, it is pain. Now I want to go on next to talking about place, space, and spirit. And this is something that's been heightened for me, I think, by First Nations people and their clarity and wisdom about this. So Mary Graham, for example, says, for Aboriginal people, the land is the great teacher. It not only teaches us how to relate to it, but to each other. It suggests a notion of caring for something outside ourselves, something that is and of nature and that will exist for all time. And that this physical and spiritual are constantly interconnecting. So Michelle McMahon, a First Nations colleague of mine, often when she's trying to help people understand a First Nations worldview, will ask people, so what kind of land, what kind of landscape is it that really speaks to you, what do you feel most connected to? And then of course she gets people to speak about that and explore it. And for me, the two images that come to mind are firstly this image of Scotland, an island off the west coast of Scotland, which has that combination of land, sea and hills that I find very powerful for me. But interestingly, alongside that comes this image of the Red Desert, which is what the children in our house called the land at the back of our place, old gold mining country that has this beautiful red color. So I think this part of the tapestry is about reminding us to pay attention to the physical world and to ask how we are nurtured by and in turn can take responsibility to nurture it. And we usually think about this as the natural world, but it can also be in urban environments can be rewarding, and in what we do physically and creatively and how we live our lives every day. Are we able to imbue the spirit in washing the dishes and cooking, gardening? You know, what are the things that you, all of the physical things that you do, noticing in your body how you express that and embody it as well. And I'm going to read part of a poem by Robin Sinclair, written during Meeting for Learning, that illustrates this. She'd been writing about the many birds that shared our space, and says, each one of these is perfectly evolved to fill its niche. People are different and fit in more awkwardly. Down here on the ground, we human beings slowly pace and think and write and meditate, trying to find our path. And all these things flow into us. The sunlit sky, the cooling night, the comforting unfolding dark, the air that's heavy with the scent of eucalypt and honey, and the warm concern of all of us, for all of us, reaching out arms to hold each other up. We find the spirit here, and underneath it all, the orchestration of the birds. Now, I think for me, underpinning all of these are the qualities that I've talked here about: openness, humility, and courage to ask. And this is partly about embracing, listening to each other deeply in the spirit. And again, I think for me, First Nations people talk about this so helpfully. So Miriam Rose Ungermer Bauman writes that First Nations people call this Tadiri, although I think it's called different, the language is different in different places, which recognizes the deep spring that is inside us. We call on it and it calls to us. This is the gift that Australia is thirsting for. It is something like what you call contemplation. She points out the need for patience and waiting. We wait on God too. His time is the right time. We wait for him to make his word clear to us. We don't worry. We know that in time and in the spirit of Tadiri, that deep listening and quiet stillness, this way will be clear. And I think listening in this way means listening with humility and vulnerability, being open to the spirit, to the wisdom of others, instead of assuming that our way is the right way. And related to that, I think, is courage. Courage about asking for what we need in the spiritual journey. Our society stresses independence and privacy and managing, being self-reliant. So it's challenging to admit that we have struggles and that we need help and support from other people. Okay, so next, I think part of the spiritual journey that relates to this, and this is also about courage, I think, and in a sense, humility and openness is about recognizing and using the gifts that we have. And for many people, I think it's harder to accept their gifts and their limitations. The tall poppy syndrome in Australia has a lot to answer for. So important to ask, so how am I gifted? How can I use my gifts for bringing about greater flourishing, ensuring that I'm acting in life-enhancing ways for myself and for other people? And part of that, again, is back to community, and it links again with active discernment, this next part of the spiritual journey. Being prepared to ask other people for help to become clear about, well, who am I? And what are the gifts? What's my vocation? What's my being vocation, my sense of who I am and what I have to offer, as well as what it is that I do. So one of the hard things, of course, is about discerning where am I being led and what is being in union with spirit? When am I truly in union? And when am I simply living from my ego? And you might ask yourself, where am I most wholly myself? And how do I make sure that I'm checking in with myself and others about, am I being genuinely led? A significant experience of this for me, I think, was a work one. And this goes back to my childhood experience of expecting God always to be there for me. And in my working life, I had been very fortunate right up into my mid 30s, I'd say, of always feeling I was in the right place at work. It felt spirit-led to be there. But then the particular job I had ended. I was made redundant. The state government decided that my organization was no longer a good thing. And I was offered a job by a friend in an agency that I thought was philosophically something that I felt quite attuned to and would be comfortable working in. But after I'd been there for probably about a year, 18 months, maybe my gratitude was wearing off, and I began to realize that I actually didn't feel right there. While there were many positive things about the organization I could acknowledge, it just didn't feel right for me. And then fortunately for me, another opportunity arose from within that organization to do something in another one. And although the organization had a lot of problems, big bureaucracy, et cetera, actually, spiritually, it felt right to be there. So that was an important lesson for me about stopping, not just accepting something out of gratitude or relief or speedily moving. Now, obviously, we don't always have total choice about that. We need to live, we need to eat. But maybe if we paid attention to those inner messages more often, we would avoid making some decisions that are unhelpful. And I think in Friends, we have ways that people help each other make these kinds of discernments. In clearness meetings, business meetings, we're quite practiced at it. So this brings me to being intentional. And what I mean by that is really seeking ways or help to know each other, to know ourselves and each other in the things that are eternal. So to make a commitment to doing something about your spiritual journey, being active about it. Now, of course, what you do will change at any particular time, but what's consistent here is the need to be faithful and actively intentional. So it's interesting, you know, we do a lot of things, well, some of us perhaps more than others, but about getting fit, you know, going to the gym. We know that in order to build our physical strength, we need to exercise. So similarly, we need to work on our spiritual muscles. We need to make a commitment to doing things. Now, obviously, as friends, we have meeting for worship, and people have a variety of spiritual practices that relate to that. Prayer, meditation, meeting for worship, perhaps during the week, as well as on Sundays. And those are important things for us. But I think it's also important to work out what else is it that you need at this particular time. It might need courage to ask for people to help you do it. You know, is it that you need to go to Silver Wattle to do a program and you need people in your family to agree to look after your children or an older parent? What is it that you need and how can you get there? We're fortunate in Australia, I think, in having Silver Wattle and in having the Meeting for Learning program, but also many meetings offer an incredible range of activities, really, that can nurture the spiritual life as well as meeting for worship. Something like journaling is something that many people find helpful. And I want to just read briefly from something that Catherine Hayward wrote when she was a Meeting for Learning participant. I'm also struck by the power of this reflective journaling, which enables the hidden to become more accessible. When I reread this next extract from my journal, I wondered how I could have forgotten it, for the experience was very powerful. Some people find going to something like Myers-Briggs workshops, Enneagram workshops, workshops that help you understand yourself better are also really powerful in the spiritual journey. And I've certainly had that experience myself, working with a a Catholic nun who was wonderful, really, at helping you make the connection between what this meant in a secular way to what it meant in a spiritual way. Some people use things like drawing. Wilma Davidson, for example, uses drawing and painting mandalas as a form of spiritual practice. Really, it doesn't matter what you do, so long as you make a commitment to it. I've found that in recent years, what has been a powerful spiritual practice for me is simply walking in the forest. And I'm going to put the slide on of the forest at the back of our place. That is very helpful to me if I am struggling with something or wrestling with a decision. I walk in the forest and I'm amazed at how often there is either clarity or some kind of spiritual comfort that comes from that. And of course, there are times I walk and I'm just walking. But if I am doing that consciously, from a spiritual perspective, it is amazing how helpful it can be. So it's a matter of working out for you what you find most helpful. So it's about, I think, for me, embedding the spiritual in everyday life, so that all of what you're doing, it comes from that place. And I want to finish with two readings. One is Advices and Queries 7, and be aware of the Spirit of God at work in the ordinary activities and experiences of your daily life. There is inspiration to be found all around us in the natural world, in the sciences and arts, in our work and friendships, in our sorrows as well as our joys. I also want to read, because much of this comes back to nurturing our own spiritual self, so that what we do flows, all that we do flows from that. And I'm going to finish by returning to my own spiritual roots in a way, to a Scottish Celtic book of prayer. Why is there so little anxiety to get time to pray? Why is there so much speaking, yet so little prayer? Why is there so much running to and fro, yet so little prayer? In one single quiet hour of prayer, the soul will often make more progress than in days of company with others. It is in the desert that dew falls freshest and the air is purest. So with the soul, it is when none but God is nigh, it is then that the soul gathers in wondrous refreshment and power and energy. And so it is also in this way that we become truly useful to others. It is when coming out fresh from communication with God that we go forth to work successfully.